Hello, this is Dr. Lorna Rivera from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. In this video, I want to talk about the question of, are we living in a post-racial society? Racism against immigrants continues to be a persistent social problem in the United States. And several studies have documented how hate crimes against immigrants are actually increasing by 40% in the United States. And part of what sociologists have been trying to understand is why that is happening. And what is the new racism in the United States? Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva wrote a book called Racism Without Racists, Colorblind Racism and the Persistence of Racial Inequality in the United States. And this book and his theory of colorblind racism is very important. What he says basically is that the civil rights movement made great strides in advancing equal rights under the law. But the reality is that people of color continue to experience discrimination and oppression. And sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva argues that the Jim Crow system was replaced by a new racism, a color-blind racism. That despite the removal of laws and policies enforcing segregation, there has been little improvement in racial inequality. And also that immigrants are continue to be racialized in the United States. For example, there is much evidence that racial inequality and especially housing discrimination against darker-skinned minorities. We know that dark-skinned minorities are 3 times more likely to be poor. They earn less than whites, they have higher unemployment rates, and have 1/10 the net wealth of whites. Even with the same exact level of education, people of color are more likely to be unemployed and have lower wages than whites. Although there is widespread institutionalized racism, many Americans still assume that racism is no longer a social problem. In fact, we elected a black president in the United States, so we're not racist anymore, is some of the comments that I've heard. I've also think that these attitudes are supported by the fact that surveys find that white Americans believe discrimination against immigrants and people of color is a thing of the past. White people generally believe that whites are actually more likely to face job discrimination than people of color in recent surveys. So recognizing that racism even exists remains a challenge for most white Americans, and even more and more African Americans are also having difficulty recognizing that racism is a social problem. In research by sociologists, many African Americans that were interviewed believed that the passage of civil rights legislation eliminated racially discriminatory practices and that any problems that blacks may experience now were, quote, of their own doing. So this belief in a colorblind society assumes that discrimination is a thing of the past and denies the reality of race and racial inequality today. And central to the colorblindness belief is the belief that we should treat people simply as human beings rather than racialized beings. Some people think that viewing all humans as equal is non-racist. The fact is that we do not live in a world where people start their lives on an equal playing field. So if we believe all people have equal opportunity to succeed, if someone is not successful, then we are likely to believe their failures are a result of their own poor choices or their personal flaws. And worse, colorblind racism assumes that we now have an equal playing field, and people are treated then in a colorblind fashion. So any differences that we see in the success of racial groups is due to inherent differences in the groups themselves. And this reasoning can lead us back to early racist beliefs about racial inferiority. The beliefs that there are inherent differences in intelligence, culture, and values among the races. So I ask us to think about, to what extent do we think about colorblind racism in our society today? And I hope that we can talk about that in the interactive session. I also wanted to talk about recent research that is showing how immigrants are racialized, especially around the politics of language oppression. Sociologists Jose Cobas and Joe Fagan, wrote a book called Language Oppression and Resistance. And their paper examines how whites attempt to maintain dominance over Latinos in particular in their everyday interactions, and how they employ discriminatory strategies to discourage the use of Spanish speaking. They based their research on interviews with Latinos who also described the strategies of resistance to language oppression. And why is this happening? Why is there an increasing sense of language as a threat in this country? The increasing population of Latinos has raised concern about the impact of the browning of America on the American way of life and the English language. But what sociologists are arguing is that for Latinos who can be of any race, language and accent become the racial markers. Language is how Latinos become racially marked in white minds. For example, one interview with a light-skinned Latino man who was interviewed said he didn't suffer discrimination until he opened his mouth to speak. Whites viewed Latino speech as tainted because they perceive Spanish to be a language that is illegal. It doesn't belong in this country. If they hear it spoken, they think that Latinos are plotting behind their backs. So sociologists are really interested in how does language discrimination also benefit capitalism? If Latino workers are cheap labor and the official language of English is used in the legal system, in schools, and in voting booths, why are these methods being used to limit the use of language in our society? And this research about language oppression in Latinos found that many whites would silence Latinos when they would speak in their own language in the public, in public, on the train, in line at the grocery store, asking them to stop speaking Spanish. Whites had fear and suspicion and wanted to know what's going on if Spanish is being spoken. Latinos who spoke Spanish were ignored in restaurants and stores. They were teased, and deriding of accents was very common. And Latinos' proficiency in Spanish itself was also questioned. And there was disbelief among whites when Latinos demonstrated they were skilled in English. And the research that was done on college students was particularly disturbing because students were often accused of plagiarism. They were told how articulate they were, and teachers would be surprised at how well they did in their grades, and they were accused of cheating and plagiarism. So these are some important issues to consider today, that racism is taking different forms, and it can take the form of language oppression as well. Today, many people in the United States continue to believe that all immigrants should give up their culture entirely. And these so-called melting pot theories do support the assimilation of immigrants. One of the earliest writings about this was in 1782, where Hector St. John Crèvecoeur wrote, "What is the American, this new man?" And the proposed answer was, "He is neither a European nor the descendant of a European. Here, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men." So this idea of the melting pot, that newcomers should move toward the culture of the whole society, they should give up their heritage along the way, and the whole society should also change. This idea that the culture of each ethnic group should be blended and a new and different culture emerges, this is something that is still very popular in our consciousness. But I argue that the melting pot is a political symbol. It's used to strengthen and legitimize the ideology of America as a land of opportunity, where race, religion, and national origin should not be barriers to social mobility. I urge us to think about the culture, the ideology of a culture of pluralism, which opposes the complete merger of minorities with majority groups, but instead recognizes the right of minorities to retain their heritage and their ways of life. So I urge us to think about, how does what we have discussed so far reinforce or challenge what you think about immigration? Should we encourage the melting or merging of different groups, or should we emphasize retaining diversity of different groups in the United States?